Hello, Dr. Mashburn. And so today we're going to start our new unit on the bones. And so the fancy word for bones is the skeletal system. So we're going to talk about the bones. We're going to talk about what they do, where they are. We're going to learn how to name them. We're going to learn about cartilages associated with them. We're going to learn about disorders. So today we're just going to introduce the topic of the skeletal system. So the first thing I want to remember is we've talked about this type of tissue when we talked about the tissues in the second unit, about the tissue unit. And so bone is a type of connective tissue. So remember that, and we call it osseous tissue. So your bone is one of the types of connective tissue, and it's a specialized connective tissue that's the main element in your skeleton. It's composed of cells in an extracellular matrix, and this is the only extracellular matrix that's hard. Okay, so bone, unlike other connective tissues, calcifies and becomes hard like stone. Think back to your other connective tissues like blood, which is liquid, or adipose, which is fat and kind of squishy, or cartilage, which is kind of plasticky. So bone is the hard connective tissue, and that's what makes up our skeleton. So why do we need our bones? It has several different functions. One is support. It gives us our support for our body and our organs. It's like a scaffold, and so it's like a scaffolding for our body. If we didn't have a skeleton, we'd just be a blob on the floor. So it gives us our shape. It protects us. So you may not think about this, but your bone is making a helmet for your brain. So think about your brain inside your skull. It's literally a helmet that you've made to protect your brain. Your rib cage is going around your heart and your lungs. Okay, so it's protecting your heart and lungs. Your spinal cord runs along your spinal column, so you have little bitty bones called vertebrae, and there's a hole in the vertebra, and the spinal cord runs through that hole, so it protects the spinal cord. It allows us to move. Now we think about muscles as being what moves us. Well, they do, but they have to move the bone. So the muscles have to have something that they're acting on, and so they act as the lever so that when muscles contract, they move the bone. That allows us to move. They also act as a bank. They allow us to store minerals, especially calcium and phosphorus, and some growth factors. So we store things in our bones. So we haven't talked a lot about calcium. We will as we move through our study of anatomy and physiology. But most people know that calcium is important for strong bones. But you also have to have calcium for muscles to contract and for your nervous system to work. And so you have to have a certain amount of calcium in your blood. And so if you need more calcium in your blood, you can actually take it from your bone. Or if you have too much calcium in your blood, you can put it into your bone. Okay, so we use our skeleton as a way to manage and bank our minerals like calcium. Our skeleton is also where we make our bones, make our blood. And hematopoiesis, if you see poiesis, that means to make. Hemato means blood. And so this is where we make our blood cells. So in your bones, you have something called bone marrow, and that is the hematopoietic, or the blood cell making part of the bone. So all of your blood cells, your red blood cells, white blood cells, that's made inside of your bone. Maybe you've heard of someone get a bone marrow transplant. Well, they do that because they need to have a source of red and white blood cells. We also store energy in our bones. A lot of people don't realize this, but that marrow also stores fat. So in the adult, your bone marrow also has fat in it, and so you can actually store energy in your bone marrow. And so it actually helps us in times of famine. So if there's a time with no food, we start to pull that fat from our bone marrow as a source of energy. And then last but not least, we use it to, again, store our calcium, but we also use it to help us maintain hormonal control of calcium. So when I think about calcium, I think about how we want to control the amount of calcium in our blood. We have to understand the role of two hormones that act on the bones in order for us to regulate our calcium. And those are calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin from the thyroid and parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. And so we'll talk a little bit about this in a separate slide. So those are all the different functions that bone. It's just not strong bones to keep us erect. So when we think about the bones, we're going to have a whole section on the anatomy, and we're going to learn all the bones. There's 206 bones. And we're going to learn all the bones, and we're going to learn some features about those bones with little knobby things and holes and things like that. But the first thing we need to know is when you think about the skeleton, we think of it as really two skeletons. You have your axial skeleton and your appendicular skeleton. So if you think back to our anatomy terms, axial is, if you think about an axis, is what you pivot around. So on this particular picture, the axial is going to be this dark brown. So it's literally the center of your body. It includes the cranium, your skull, your backbone, which is called your spinal column with all your vertebrae in it, and then your rib cage. Okay, that's your axial skeleton. Your appendicular, so think appendages, that's everything else. It kind of hangs off of the axial skeleton, which includes your pectoral girdle, which is kind of your shoulders and your arms. Okay, so the stuff that hangs off the body. So you have to have a girdle to hold your arms on. So you have a pectoral girdle, which is kind of your shoulder that holds your arms on. That's your appendicular skeleton, as well as your hip bones, which is your pelvic girdle, and they hold your leg bones on. So your appendicular skeleton is your shoulder bones, hip bones, arms, and legs. And we're going to go into more detail, and you're going to learn the actual names of those bones. Right now, if I was to say os coxa, you would look at me like I was speaking a foreign language. So right now, we'll call them hip bones. All right, so that's your different skeletons. You have your axial skeleton and your appendicular skeleton. Now, we also have to think about microanatomy of bone, and so we're going to show you some pictures. You saw one in your tissue unit, and we'll talk about it again, what the microanatomy of bone looks like. There's specific cells that are associated in bone that we think about when we think of bone. The first one are your osteogenic cells, and anytime you see that genic part, that's a stem cell. So these are the precursor cells that can give rise to your bone cells. All right, so they're kind of your stem cells. Then you have your osteoblasts, and these are your bone-forming cells. So these actually make bone. So they take calcium out of the blood and put it into the bone and build your bone. Okay. Now, when an osteoblast is building bone, it's just kind of like the chondrocytes, where it builds the matrix around it and it kind of gets trapped inside that lacuna in that little cell house. And once it's trapped, it matures, and it's called a osteocyte. All right, so if osteoblasts that build bone, they trap, and then they become osteocytes, which is just a mature bone cell. And then osteoclasts are your bone breaker downers. They resorb bone. So let's say you needed calcium in your blood, you could break down your bone and basically dissolve it and send the calcium back into your bloodstream. So osteoblast build cells, osteoclast break them down. And we'll talk about how that works as we talk about bone formation and then bone repair and bone remodeling in another talk. All right, and so we're going to talk about a little bit of hormonal regulation of bone calcium. You'll get a lot of this in the endocrine system when you have your second anatomy, but I want to talk to you now because we want to start introducing these concepts. And we talked about negative feedback in our very first unit. We talked about how if our body senses something, we have a sensor, an effector, a sensor or receptor, we send that to a control center, and then the control center sends out a response to the effector, and the effector does something. Hope you remember that. We talked about with temperature, body regulation, getting hot, getting cold. Well, homeostasis also works for bone calcium levels and blood calcium levels, okay? So we regulate how much calcium is in our bone and our blood using hormones. And so there's two hormones. One's called calcitonin and one's called parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin doesn't have a huge effect in humans. Okay, it's been shown in some other animals. It doesn't have a real big effect in humans. Our major hormone that controls blood calcium and bone calcium is parathyroid hormone, which is released by the parathyroid, which are these little glands that are on the back side of the thyroid gland, and we abbreviate parathyroid hormone as PTH. So I want to introduce this to you, and so you'll have a couple of questions just to make sure we're still talking about negative feedback and how it relates to homeostasis. So I'm going to talk to you through another example of negative feedback, okay? Negative feedback. So let's say our stimulus, we see a falling amount of blood calcium levels. So the amount of calcium, and you can write calcium concentration like this, the calcium in our blood is falling. Okay, that's our stimulus. We have a receptor that picks that up. It's okay, we don't have enough calcium in our blood. We don't have enough calcium for our muscles to contract. We don't have enough calcium for our nervous system to work. We need to get more calcium in our blood. What do? Well, the parathyroid releases parathyroid hormone into the blood. Okay, so remember, hormones go into the blood, the endocrine organs, and that parathyroid hormone actually goes out to the bone and causes osteoclasts, those bone breaker downers, osteoclasts to degrade the bone, to dissolve it. And that allows calcium to be released into the blood, raising the calcium level. That will shut off. If the calcium level goes back up, that shuts off the original stimulus. Okay? So just for fun, let's just think what would happen if you had calcitonin. So let's draw a picture over here, all right? And let's say we have our stimulus, calcium levels in the blood are too high. Okay, so calcium levels in the blood are too high. We have too much calcium. Well, this would be a great chance for us to take some of that calcium out of our blood and put it into our bone and save it for later. So we have a stimulus, okay, too much calcium. We have a receptor that's saying, okay, we have too much calcium in our blood. Then the thyroid hormone, the thyroid would release calcitonin. Okay, calcitonin is a hormone. It would also go to the bone, and it would tell osteoblasts, remember those bone builders, to take the calcium out of the blood and put it into the bone, and then that would lower your blood calcium. Okay, so the two work in tandem. Not so much in humans. Our primary hormone is parathyroid hormone, but there is some evidence that calcitonin plays a role, especially in some other animals, and maybe a little bit in humans. That's still to be determined. So again, parathyroid hormone is going to be what we use to allow us to put more calcium out into our blood if we don't have enough calcium out there, by breaking down our bones, by stimulating those osteoclasts to break the bone down. And you'll learn more about osteoblasts and osteoclasts as we move through our bone lectures. That's all I'm going to talk about right now. We'll do more detail in the coming videos. Thank you very much.